welcome to the center and welcome to this interview. We know that you are a specialist in polycentricity. Many people are not clear what it is all about. I mean, it sounds interesting, polycentricity. Could you explain in a quite general sense, what is it and what makes it important today?
Okay. Well, polycentricity, first of all, I do agree that it has some kind of attractiveness to it as a concept. It's relatively unknown. It's not used in colloquial language, so it sounds as attractive to explore as covering new terrain as such, and it makes somehow intuitive sense. But often then when we come to trying to define it, it actually becomes quite difficult, and because it tries to somehow encapsulate the complexity of governance, meaning really that increasingly so people observe many actors and need to be coordinated, are interdependent hierarchically or in networks in the way, for example, in my case, social ecological systems are regulated, structured, their use is ordered, but also the way in which these actors relate to each other as networks or through markets. The coordination mechanisms are of a very diverse types. Also these polycentric relations, we encounter them in many different spheres. So we could find them in metropolitan areas, which is the origin of the concept, for example, where many different entities interact in providing for the different services for citizens. But also nowadays we are wondering if this wouldn't also be a useful description, as here in the center, for governance arrangements and constellations at the global level, where we have an increasing amount of organizations in place. We have new actors that see this field as an important terrain for interaction and for exercising influence. And we most of all also see more and more that many problems need to be addressed at the global level.
You once related the polycentricity to the global boundaries issue.
Well, polycentricity on the one hand is a descriptive notion of what we see being increasing complexity in governance, and on the other hand it's about the idea that we need to empower people to a greater extent, that we need to look at processes of self-organization in order to resolve the problems that we are encountering. And this obviously relates very well to what one sees in this very complex field of climate change governance, mitigation and adaptation, which takes place at the local levels, but also at the global level, all of which need to somehow come together. And especially at the global level, there's obviously no kind of overarching constitution, nothing that holds this together, this polycentric constellation. So also at that level, we need to think about states self-organizing, how they come together, how they relate to each other. And any problem in relation to planetary boundaries as global common good, therefore is confronted with, if you want to say so, self-organizing systems at the highest level, self-organizing of self-organizing systems.
If we have a look on your research biography, I mean, you started with issues like water and food, I think. Can you speak a little bit about this development or this possible change of focuses and of issues that are part of your personal agenda?
Yes. So it's true, I started with working on water governance predominantly in Europe. And when we think about water, not least the hydrological cycle, obviously that brings together many actors by its very nature, involved into water provision for agriculture, for urban areas, water treatment, but also involved into the provision of all kinds of ecosystem services, such as nature conservation or fish in the rivers that we see. So all these actors somehow are bound together by the hydrological cycle, and again this kind of lends itself well to conceptualizing this field of research through polycentric arrangements. How do all these actors come together? And that's something that certainly not only I realized, but in fact there's a strong community that works on water governance at the local, but also at the national and transnational level from this perspective of polycentric governance.
You are part of a blog project dealing with polycentricity. Can you talk a little bit about the scope and the spectrum of issues that you are dealing with in the blog with your colleagues?
Well, the idea is really to develop theorizing polycentricity further. So this means, on the one hand, exchanging about all kinds of scientific events where people meet and discuss either really these core concepts of polycentricity and how do we need to understand these systems of self-organization, so kind of the discussion of a very coherent framework, but also what are empirical observations that lend themselves to thinking through this lens of polycentricity. So people would report on certain events in agriculture. I, for example, recently wrote a blog entry on how we should perceive organic agriculture, global organic agricultural trade through the perspective of polycentricity, where you have regulators at various levels. You've got many NGOs involved. You've got all components of a value chain. So again, a complexity of actors that relate to each other in very different forms, depending on specific national, constitutional, and historical context, but also depending on the way consumers or the way citizens interact with the way, in this case, in the case of organic agriculture, certain environmental benefits are, for example, provided for. So the idea of this blog is to develop the concept and to transpose it to new fields and to communicate that there is an expanding group of scholars that works on this and that follows this agenda.
It's interesting that polycentricity on the one side is something to grasp or to comprehend a variety that you observe in the world, in the processes and objects that you find in the world outside. And at the same time, it's a concept that tries to develop a strategy for governance to come to terms with all this variety. Standards are one of these issues. I mean, you have a variety, you try to regulate everything, so you develop standards.
Well, standards would always only be a temporary phenomenon in a kind of evolutionarily polycentric perspective on governance. Exactly as you say, it would be about kind of ordering this complexity for a certain period of time to the benefit of consumers, of citizens, of producers, all of them aligning their ideas, their incentives and their preferences in relation to one standard. But in a constellation of polycentric governance, there would always be room in an ideal world, if that was existing, the idea of an ideally structured polycentric governance context, there would then competition between standards emerging, where over time any standard could well be replaced by a different standard that, for example, strives to reach more ambitious goals in relation to climate change or in relation to organic production standards, etc. So there would be the idea of polycentricity, therefore, is to some extent to instill a type of competition over the way public goods are provided through allowing for alternatives of organizing the provision and production of these public goods and services, and to grant the possibility to citizens/consumers to actually opt for the way they like provision and production of public goods to be provided best. I want to use the one-year fellowship that I have here at the center in order to exactly what I had just described, in order to therefore transpose my understanding of polycentric governance, which very much centered on the governance of natural resources and water management, to the productive sector of agriculture, meaning biofuel production, transnational biofuel production and transnational biofuel trade, therefore, and organic production and trade, and its transnational regulation. And think about what it means to analyze these production-oriented sectors in relation to the public goods they also provide, meaning environmental conservation, meaning climate change benefits, climate change mitigation benefits, to see how we need to conceptualize these on a theoretical level, and secondly, to understand better what are productive versions of polycentric governance. So the precise idea is to compare biofuel and organic production in Germany with biofuel and organic production in Brazil, and to relate that to the transnational regulation of these sectors and trade flows between these two countries.
There was an article from you and a colleague, and in the title there was very nicely framed as "Wolves are mobile while fruit trees are not."
Yes.
Could you explain that conundrum to us?
Yes. Well, I mean, the statement as such doesn't need much explanation, obviously. But it's true that, particularly in relation also to polycentric governance and institutional analysis more in general, many scholars, in my view and in the view of many colleagues of mine, don't pay sufficient attention to the structure of the problems that are being addressed. So it certainly makes a huge difference if we look at wolves or water, which as a resource is governing mobile flows or a mobile object. That makes a huge difference to the way governance needs to be structured in comparison to, for example, the governance of locally stable fruit trees. So there's issues of scale coming in, issues of transaction costs, issues of monitoring costs, and problems of governance relating to one or the other type of problem that we need to take into account if we want to properly understand governance arrangements.
Thank you, Andreas, and we wish you success.
Thank you.